Today we are talking with John Norris, the author of Mary McGrory, the trailblazing columnist who stood Washington on its head. Welcome to Readara.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have a very well-written book that has also received some nice coverage in the media, and obviously the person that you're talking about is also kind of very path-breaking in the newspaper and obviously in the journalism industry. Tell us a little bit more about why did you choose to write about her and what brought your attention to this person?
You know, I had the good pleasure of knowing Mary McGrory a bit late in her life when I was fairly young and new to Washington. And the more I got to know her and see her in action, the more I really appreciated that it was a great untold story, that this was a woman who was syndicated in 200 papers around the United States. Her column had some of the sharpest political writing you could imagine. She was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. She'd been on Nixon's enemies list with 2 stars and asterisks. And what really stood out to me, and I think made her success all the more remarkable, was she really came from very humble beginnings, that she grew up in a family just outside of Boston, that she was the first one to go to college. Her dad was a postal clerk. There was really nothing in her background or arc that would have suggested that she would have become one of the most important American journalists of the 20th century.
So did she have the drive, or because of her background was not as good as it could have been, that also pushed her more in achieving? Was she success-oriented? Was she goal-driven?
You know, it was really interesting that Mary left a great number of her papers to the Library of Congress, and her family was also quite generous in sharing correspondence and journals from early in her life. You know, and she just decided very early on that she wanted to be a journalist, that she had read a comic strip, kind of a forerunner to the old Brenda Starr comics of a swashbuckling woman reporter, and decided that's what she wanted to do as early as 15 or 16. And she worked hard to get a job at a newspaper, initially in the book review department. She wanted to cover politics. They told her that was unacceptable. One of her editors, and what I thought was a rather funny comment for anybody who knew Mary later in life, said that she was too shy to make a good reporter. But with a lot of persistence, her book reviews in Boston started to get noticed. And her big breakthrough initially was that the editor of the New York Times book review quite liked her work and ran a couple of her reviews in the Times. That was a time when women were almost non-existent in the New York book review pages, and that led to her getting a job at the old Washington Star here in Washington, D.C. Again, initially in the book review department, where she toiled for a great number of years, dying to cover politics, really agitating again and again to do it. You know, and I think it really speaks to her persistence that eventually her editors said that she should go and cover the Army McCarthy hearings, and that became a seminal moment in her career and in American journalism.
Why was she drawn to politics? Why her beat became politics or political news coverage?
You know, I think part of that, and she certainly attributed to it, you know, she grew up in Boston, and Boston, when she was growing up, was a place of fantastically colorful and corrupt politics. You know, it was larger than life. It was a time when Boston Irish Americans were really starting to exert their influence because she was Irish American. I think she identified with that. It was a time in Boston when she was growing up when Mayor Curley actually served part of his term from a jail cell, but was still mayor and still reelected after that. So it was all quite florid and larger than life, but she was really drawn to it, and it was just something that she was in her bones.
And is that the reason why you have a very interesting subtitle, The Trailblazing Columnist Who Stood Washington on Its Head? In which way she stood Washington on its head?
You know, I think that to really understand it, you kind of go back to her big breakthrough with the Army McCarthy hearings, that she was sent by her editor, Newbie Noyes, to cover every single day of the hearings. And this was at a time when the nation was absolutely riveted with the Army McCarthy hearings. It was the climactic showdown between the U.S. Army and Senator Joe McCarthy. The Red Scare was absolutely at its height. And Joe McCarthy had destroyed the careers of almost too many journalists and Foreign Service officers and career civil servants to count. You know, and Mary went and covered the hearings, and her editor gave her a fantastic piece of advice and said, you should really write about these hearings like you're writing a letter home to your favorite aunt. And Mary did. And she wrote about the goings-on in the hearings in a way that was really conversational. It was funny. It was sharp. And she said that when she saw Joe McCarthy walk into the room amid this kind of cascade of flashbulbs and people jostling around and the benches filled with press, she had kind of this instant snap of recognition that this was just kind of another Irish bully boy that she'd seen his likes and wakes and weddings kind of her whole life growing up in Boston. And she was more than willing to kind of call him out and time to make fun of him. And almost overnight, for somebody whose book reviews were almost never heard of, Mary became something of a national sensation. Her 30-something columns on the hearings became an absolute must-read. And because she was willing to talk about politics and write about politics, in the way that we talk about politics. And it wasn't kind of the usual he said, she said of wire service stories, that she understood that people's personalities really drive their politics, and she dug into it. And I think that that's fairly common on news pages now, but at the time it was fairly revolutionary. And she was absolutely dedicated to doing field work, to getting out there, to going to the hearings in person, and then subsequently to make sure that she was up on Capitol Hill and on presidential campaigns. And unlike most opinion writers, she saw her approach to her work almost like that of a police reporter, that she insisted on doing her own legwork, that she felt that she kind of needed to see the people she was covering. She needed to see the whites of their eyes to do it properly. And it was fascinating that I did scores and scores of interviews for the book, and Mary's commitment to doing her own legwork and to getting out there in the field as an opinion writer was mentioned by every single person that I interviewed, often without me raising it. So I think that was one of her defining characteristics.
So she didn't conform in the age of conformity at that time.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the fact that she was a woman was perhaps, in a lot of ways, equally revolutionary. That this was a time when the New York Times, on its entire staff, had about 4 women who were actually working as writers rather than secretaries, who sat in a single row. Getting married was a fireable offense for most reporters and most newspapers. It was almost unheard of to see women reporters on the kind of rough and tumble campaign trail. The National Press Gallery and Press Club didn't allow women to attend events, and when they were eventually partially allowed to attend, they had to sit up in the rafters and then be hustled out of the building, down the back stairs, down the fire escape as soon as someone was done speaking. And so the fact that there was this woman who was writing this kind of very fresh, very vivacious political copy out on the campaign trail and out buttonholing senators and congressmen in the halls of Congress was really modern and really, really shocking to a lot of people. And, and Mary was quite shrewd about the advantages and disadvantages of being a woman, that she figured out that lots of politicians thought that because she was a woman, she probably didn't understand much about politics. So they would try to explain things to her, and Mary would kind of do her aw shucks routine, and then the politician would be shocked when they opened up the newspaper the next day to read what they'd said and to see themselves quoted in black and white. And Mary also, even though she probably got paid less, even though the New York Times, when they wanted her to come over and work for them, asked if she could cover the phones in the morning, which was absolutely insulting, made the best of it. She made the men carry her typewriter and use them as her personal valet service. And she navigated that landscape the best she could.
Why did political leaders want to talk to her? What was in it for her? They could have always said, in the age of television, I don't need another person telling about me through her opinion. I can talk to the audience directly.
Well, the Washington Star, where Mary started out, and later the Washington Post, were enormously important newspapers. They were some of the most important newspapers in the country, and the Post obviously still is. And Mary was charming, that she was a really intriguing person. And this is, again, kind of what attracted me to her story, that she was kind of classically trained at girls' Latin school in Boston, that she could recite Yeats from memory, that she was an avid reader. She knew all the classics. She knew Jane Austen by heart. But she smoked and she drank and she could talk ward politics with the best of them. She was attractive and engaging, and I think for an awful lot of politicians, that was a really heady mix. Here was this woman who could quote Shakespeare from memory, but also kind of knew how Clark County in Nevada had voted the last 3 cycles, and was willing to have a drink of scotch and talk horse race politics. So I think that was fantastically intriguing for her subjects, and it gave her what was really unique access that, Mary almost never used background quotes. She pretty much used everything on the record, but she was kind of a constant presence behind the scenes, particularly in presidential campaigns, where because people trusted her, she was kind of allowed in headquarters, and she was allowed in the candidates' suite along with the kind of top campaign officials, because she wasn't really interested in kind of a one-day scoop. She wanted to know what made politicians tick and how they operated and what drove them and what their insecurities looked like. And that really came out in her copy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Give us a little bit of history about how she handled the McCarthy, Army McCarthy hearings. And, I think she was, sometimes people said she had more courage than the most of the men who were covering and that can maybe also give us a little bit of nuanced view about her character and how she actually fought the glass ceiling and kind of came to a prominence, as you said, after 30 columns.
Sure. It was really interesting because, as I said, Mary had fought for years to get a chance at the newsroom, and she's given this big chance to cover the hearings. And her editor said that he didn't just kind of want a wire service story about it. He wanted something that read more like a theater review of the politics of it all. And it would have been really easy for Mary to play it safe and just to try to write it the way columns were usually written at the time, and to end every column with "only time will tell." And I went through thousands of Mary's columns over the year, and I don't think she ever ended a single one with "only time will tell" or "on the other hand." She was quite unequivocal in her opinions, and her willingness to really portray the hearings in a very stark light, of describing Roy Cohn looking like somebody who'd gotten in trouble at camp and was bringing the senator in to try to fix things, and the way that she talked about Joseph Welch, the Army counsel, who ultimately kind of became the hero of the hearings, in very personal, very affable ways, to describe Joe McCarthy as some kind of new monster. That took real courage for somebody who was new to the front page of the Washington Star, and new on the political scene, and knew this might be their only real chance. So, I think it was not only the intestinal fortitude involved, but she was also an incredibly graceful writer, that her copy just moves, it's light, it lands very well, and she just absolutely fretted over it, that she had a habit of rolling up copies of her leads that she didn't like into little balls and kind of throwing the little wads of paper by her desk. And one of her colleagues came in one day and counted 37 wadded up leads that she had abandoned during the night, and said that he called them her anguishes. Said about 37 anguishes. It must have been a very tough column last night. She really wanted to get every word right. And when you read her copy, it really does come out. They're beautifully crafted columns. They were done in a way that was funny and impertinent. And it was kind of the way that we talk about politics around the kitchen table. And that was absolutely sensational. And the timing of doing it around Army McCarthy was perfect. And almost immediately during the hearings, her career really began to skyrocket. She was featured in Time magazine. Other newspapers tried to hire her away. She got offers from 4 different publishing houses in the same day after the Time magazine profile for her to write a book. And she said a polite no thank you, that she just wanted to write her column and kind of do what she did. But, it was, I think, a struggle at times, that there were lots of other editors that gave Newby Noyes at the Washington Star grief that he was hiring a woman. It certainly put obstacles in the way in her personal life. When you're told that you can only have your job if you're not going to be married, that makes it very difficult. And indeed, when Newbie Noise first offered her the chance to go cover the hearings, he said, well, you're not going to go get married and settle down and have kids anytime soon, are you? Making quite clear that if she did that, she wouldn't be allowed the chance to cover the hearings. And, there was that kind of blatant and subtle sexism and discrimination throughout her career, and she just kind of muscled through it, that she eventually got onto the floor of the press club as a admitted women after the visit of Premier Khrushchev from the Soviet Union. And institution after institution slowly fell, but it really did take a lot of hard work and advocacy. She wasn't a classic feminist in the way that most of us would think about it, but she thought that she should have every opportunity to do her job, and objected to anything that was put in her way and as an obstacle to her doing her job just because she was a woman. And because of that trailblazing approach, she opened the doors for scores and scores of women who followed her.
She's one of the very few people who have the privilege of covering presidential elections from Kennedy all the way to George Bush. Kind of give us how the presidential elections changed over the years and decades, and what kind of key role she played. If you want to highlight some of the events, or she was obviously very close, as the book points out, with the Kennedys.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the really interesting things in the book is her career was long enough, 50 years of reporting, basically, that it really does mark some incredible changes in the industry and how journalism itself interacts with politics in this country. When Mary first started out, TV was fairly new and they were relegated to the back of the room. Print reporters were given the prime seats in the front and were considered far more important. That began to change over time, and politicians began to adjust everything so that they made sure that they were on TV and that the cameras were in front, and the unwashed masses of print reporters were kind of towards the back. But also what's really striking from her first real presidential campaign was 1956, where she was covering the campaign first of the Democratic vice presidential candidate, Estes Kefauver, and then Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic presidential nominee. And reading the notes and wires and telegrams from her on the trail, it was incredibly accessible. The Kefauver was on the same little tiny plane with the reporters. They all drank together. They sang songs together. They gave each other a hard time. Kefauver was known as a bit of a ladies' man, but none of the reporters ever were so indiscreet as to kind of raise that in their columns. And there was a real easy familiarity between reporters and politicians. And, and I think there was, in ways good and bad, there was kind of a tacit agreement to keep some things out of the news. And obviously, as we've moved into more of a gotcha culture and more of culture that where scandal drives page clicks and everything else, that politicians were worried that anything they said would be on the record, and that anytime they had a drink would show up in a negative light. And I think there became a real distance between the working press and politicians over time. And I think that's something of a loss. I think that it means that we as consumers of the news tend to get things that are more packaged by campaigns, that are more camera ready, and we know less and less about the real people that are candidates. And I think that in a lot of ways, trying to judge how people are going to do in office, knowing who they really are as a person, probably says a lot more than a whole lengthy list of policy statements. But you also raised the question of a relationship with the Kennedys. It was a fascinating one and a very close one. Mary was from Boston. She knew the Kennedys as a powerhouse family, and obviously something of business and political royalty, even at that point. Jack Kennedy, when he first came to Congress as a bachelor, actually invited Mary out on a date at one point, but it was done in a very Kennedy-esque fashion, that someone approached Mary, an intermediary asked Mary if she wanted to go out on a date with Kennedy, and she said, well, if Jack Kennedy wants to ask me on a date, he can ask me in person, which he then did. The romance didn't go anywhere. I think Mary was quite conservative in affairs of the heart. And she also knew that as a lower middle class kid from Roslindale, that this was not the kind of person that the Kennedys would settle down with. So I think she was quite honest about that. But they struck up a long-lasting friendship. And she had a funny remark to one of her friends, actually, after her date with Kennedy, that he absolutely had to do something about that mess of his hair. And the Kennedys always assumed that Mary should be 100% for them because she was Irish Catholic from Boston. But actually, Mary, in Kennedy's initial race, was quite supportive of Adlai Stevenson until Kennedy prevailed. And, then I think Mary became very supportive. And she did have a very close relationship with both Jack and Bobby Kennedy. She was thrilled to see him in the White House. In a lot of ways, that this was her ideal as far as a politician went, because obviously Jack Kennedy was incredibly erudite. He was fast on his feet. He had a sense of humor. He was a good retail politician, but he also understood kind of machine politics and how it gets done. And I think that she really, not in a literal sense, but there was a real love affair with the Kennedy administration, even though she was tough on him at times. But then obviously he was assassinated, and Mary's columns after he was killed are still widely cited as some of the finest American political writing that has ever been done. Her column, particularly on Kennedy's funeral, still taught in journalism classes as one of the finest pieces of commentary that's ever been done in an American newspaper. They were moving. They were well written. There was a bit of humor even among the tears. And she was crushed. She was churning out a column a day after the assassination, sometimes two. She was there when his body arrived from Dallas out at Andrews Air Force Base, sitting at her typewriter, bawling and still churning out some of the finest copy imaginable. And it was really a remarkable piece of work for a journalist and a remarkable personal testament to who she thought Jack Kennedy was, what we were as a country, and where we were as a country. And I can't recommend those columns highly enough.
Moving on, how did she interact with, obviously, on the other side, with President Nixon, who they didn't get along very well, to say the least?
Mary and Richard Nixon were the best of enemies. They were perfectly cast as opposites in almost every way imaginable. I have almost a harder time imagining two more different people. She was quite tough on Nixon. Her column after Nixon lost the California gubernatorial race was, she compared Nixon to a kamikaze pilot who keeps apologizing as he attacks. Her column was called Exit Snarling, and it was a masterful takedown of his bitter, frustrated press conference on the morning after he'd lost the election. And then obviously, as Nixon ultimately became president, Mary was staunchly objected to the Vietnam War, and her columns on LBJ were incredibly tough as well. But she thought Nixon was secretive and just committed to keeping Vietnam going on indefinitely. She wrote incredibly tough columns about him. And Richard Nixon saw her as an enemy of the state, full stop. That it came out in the White House, the Watergate tapes, that he had directed the head of the IRS to have her taxes audited. Mary's apartment was broken into a number of times during this period, which she joked that she'd originally thought was just the work of honest thieves, but was likely the White House. She showed up on the infamous enemies list. She was the only woman to make the list of Nixon's top 20 political enemies, and her name was highlighted with 2 stars and an asterisk, probably indicating that the IRS had been directed to go after her. And he really brought the whole authority of the state against her. But in another sign of how much he really misunderstood her, he had her taxes audited, assuming that would make her afraid to write about him, or that because she was a reporter, obviously she was covering up things in her taxes. What it turned out in the end was because Mary was quite generous with her charitable giving and actually volunteered an enormous amount of her time at a local orphanage here in Washington, D.C., that she ended up getting larger refunds because she had, under underreported the amount of her actual charitable giving after the IRS audited her several years in a row. And somewhat sweet justice out of all of this that Mary won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the Watergate hearings, which were beautifully done. And she obviously could have won probably years before and probably should have won years before. But because her style was, again, somewhat revolutionary for the period, I think the Pulitzer Committee was a little slow to recognize that. But she was delighted to win the Pulitzer and thought that Nixon was somebody just horribly miscast in politics, that he was insecure, didn't like the people part of politics very much, and in a lot of ways that she was, history proved her right on those scores.
Moving on, did she have more closer relationship of the leading presidents probably with President Clinton and also with Ronald Reagan? How did she, perceive that evolution as well?
Yeah, to go a bit out of order, I think the other kind of key relationships are a couple during the 60s. That Lyndon Johnson was quite enamored with Mary. There's a number of, because he also had a recording system in the White House, there were a number of conversations recorded where he would rant and rave at his press secretary, who was Bill Moyers at the time, that Moyers absolutely needed to get Mary straight, and that as he joked that Mary's the best columnist in Washington and she's getting better and better at my expense. And so he cared what she wrote, but he was also attracted to her. On a rather famous incident, Mary was at her home early in the Johnson presidency. In the early evening, she got a call from someone identifying them as Secret Service and saying that President Johnson was going to stop by her apartment. Mary was skeptical and thought that it was one of her colleagues pulling her leg. But then she looked down the hallway and there were two Secret Service agents positioned at the elevator bank. Lyndon Johnson came and knocked on the door, and Mary, after furiously cleaning up her apartment, they sat and had a glass of scotch and talked a bit. And President Johnson said, "Mary, I'm crazy about you, and I want to be with you." But Johnson was a difficult personality and also insecure in his own ways, and in what probably is one of the worst pickup lines imaginable, said, "I know you were crazy about the Kennedys, so now you should be crazy about me," which is an incredibly awkward thing to say after someone's been assassinated. Mary gently but firmly said she appreciated the president's friendship, but didn't want to be romantically involved with him. And they finished their scotches, and President Johnson went on his way. And Mary continued to bedevil Johnson throughout his term because she was so convinced that Vietnam was a disaster for the country. And it was quite interesting that Mary is somebody who, always wore impeccably tailored suits and dresses and was quite stylish, became something of a darling of the youth anti-war movement. She developed some good friends within the anti-war movement, young students. And Mary was absolutely convinced that Bobby Kennedy needed to challenge President Johnson in the 1968 primary. There's a absolutely spellbinding set of notes that were in Mary's files of when she sat down and interviewed Bobby in a Senate office in the tail end of 1967. And Mary said in no uncertain terms that Bobby absolutely needed to run for president. He needed to take on Johnson, that the war was a national disgrace, that the president was only able to appear in public on military bases, and that he absolutely had to do it. And that's crossing a lot of lines as a journalist. That's even as an opinion writer telling a leading politician of the day they needed to run. Bobby resisted, said that he thought it would split the party, that it was the wrong thing to do, that even though his wife and kids agreed with Mary, he wouldn't do it. And then Mary became quite engaged with Eugene McCarthy as he launched his long shot bid to take on President Johnson in the primary. Mary was in New Hampshire every day leading up to the primary, where McCarthy didn't beat Johnson, but came within just a hairbreadth of doing so, and really, which upended the national political calculus. She was there encouraging students to turn out and volunteer and to go door to door. And it was her coverage of kind of the youth movement surging into New Hampshire during the '68 primary that really made it a national story. I interviewed some of the more important heads of the anti-war youth movement at the time, who are all a little older now, obviously. But they said that it was Mary's work and support and coverage that really began to give them some national momentum. And Mary and Gene McCarthy had known each other for years. They were quite close. He was also Irish Catholic. He also could recite Yeats from memory. He also liked to have a stiff drink now and again. A number of people that I interviewed, there was a lot of suggestion that perhaps the two were entangled romantically at some point during 1968, though obviously it didn't end well. And it was a really heady moment for a period of time when it felt like maybe youth and energy could upend the national political system. And one of my favorite moments in terms of how Mary dealt with politicians, and particularly Bobby Kennedy, came about just after the primary right around the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. Bobby had done a press conference, kind of a press breakfast that morning in Washington, D.C., and this was the age before pagers and cell phones, and he was asked, were there any circumstances where he would get into the race? And he gave a rather Sherman-esque statement that he couldn't imagine that there was any way he would do so. Yet, unfortunately, halfway around the world, the Tet Offensive was unfolding in Vietnam, which was, even though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the offensive, it was really kind of the beginning of the end in a lot of ways. And so when the stories came out, it sounded like Bobby was saying that he wouldn't run for president despite the Tet Offensive, which wasn't exactly what had happened. But so when Mary saw those stories and saw those headlines, she sent Bobby Kennedy, who was still one of the most feared kind of political enforcers in the United States, sent him a telegram that said only, apparently St. Patrick did not drive all the snakes out of Ireland. And that's remarkably tough talk to a remarkably tough guy. But to their credit, Bobby turned to one of his aides who said, "Oh, well, we've lost Mary. We'll never get her back." And Bobby Kennedy said, "No, this is an Irish thing. This is a family thing. We'll sort it out." And they did get their relationship back in a better place. But, then obviously that year was absolutely wrenching. Martin Luther King was killed. Bobby was killed later in the year, which Mary felt so acutely, seeing the two Kennedy brothers killed in that way. And then the riots in Chicago at the convention. It was, and all of this culminated in Richard Nixon becoming president. It was about as horrible a year as you can imagine for her on a political level, personal level, just calamitous.
Her liberal views were often biased, and sometimes they were very complex, but they were widely read and sought after. And sometimes she was more of an opinion writer than a journalist, and often she became advisor, as you said, in the kitchen cabinet of politicians. But sometimes when she had this kind of dual role going on, she never really mentioned or disclosed that.
Yeah, and it's tricky ethical ground because she was an opinion writer, but her column rather uniquely almost always appeared, at least here in Washington, on the first or third page of the newspaper, both at the Star and then later the Post after the Star closed. And she saw it as her job to mix field reporting with opinion. And that's what her editors wanted. But because it didn't always appear on the editorial page, it created questions about kind of where was the line. Mary is fairly transparent about her views and her beliefs. She was quite liberal. She believed in causes that she believed in. She was generally opposed to war. She thought we didn't do enough to educate and protect kids, particularly those from families that had been disrupted. And she saw those as causes that she would advocate for. And obviously that created a real hornet's nest at times. That there were she was a great saver, and in her files, she would get hundreds and hundreds of letters that really opposed what she did. The Reagan era was an interesting one where the country made a real rightward shift, and Mary was one of the few real outspoken liberal voices who objected to what President Reagan was doing. And she took a lot of grief for that. But I think the fact that she kind of held steady to her course was really important. But I think that in some interesting ways, Mary presaged a little bit some of the problems we see now with journalism, in that it's really hard to tell where opinion and commentary start and where hard news begins. And, and I think that in some ways, and certainly the abuses that we see now from some news outlets that almost read like propaganda arms, I think that has unfortunately led to a lot of consumers of news who don't know what they're getting or are prone to kind of accepting misinformation sometimes. But, I think that the fact that Mary also never really looked to cash out on her position, she was not looking for big book deals. She was not looking for big TV contracts, that most of her causes were fighting for the little guy. I think that in some ways firewalled her from criticism that she was using her perch in a way that was abusive.
Anything you want to bring out during the Reagan and Clinton era? Because she, in many ways, behind the scenes, she also shaped the presidential candidates or presidential candidates' campaigns.
Yeah, I think that the Reagan years are really interesting because she was, for a period of time, kind of one of the lone liberal voices really willing to take on the Reagan presidency and to be kind of stick to her guns. And I think that was really important, and that maintaining some sense of balance is really important for the press, and not just to kind of lean whichever way it looks like the wind is going. In the Clintons, she had a complicated relationship with, that because she was very religious in a lot of ways and was somewhat conservative morally, she didn't always approve of Bill Clinton in terms of his personal behavior, and was at times appalled at his personal behavior. But she also marveled at what she called his recuperative powers as a politician. He was one of the best retail politicians she'd ever seen, and that he loved politics and loved being out there and loved talking to people and was smart about policy and smart about administration. So it was really a different creature for Mary in a lot of ways, that there were parts that she disapproved of and parts that she just absolutely wondered at. And I think one of the other things that really stands out over her career, and I was reminded of this kind of looking at this campaign season, is that Mary really believed in democracy. For somebody who covered politics over 50 years, she was remarkably not very jaded. That she still felt that people getting together in voting and town halls in New Hampshire and local meetings and city council meetings and all the way up to presidential campaigns, that they were important and they were big moral choices, and that by binding together, we could get things right. And I think that belief in the system was really important, that her whole career, even into her 80s, she loved young people. She wasn't somebody that just wanted to hear the voices of people who were rich and powerful. I went to a couple parties at her house, and you would see somebody who was an anchorman or host of Meet the Press, and you would see nuns, and you would see copy boys and interns. And she kind of took all of their opinions equally, that she was a really good listener. And I think that's something that is lost sometimes, that she thought that getting the opinion from people on the street, getting out there, talking to people, seeing things with her own eyes was enormously important. And that faith in the democratic system, that willingness to listen to the voices of the public, are something that we lose too often and too easily, I think, in the current environment. And I was also quite impressed that, she never got nostalgic about it. Tim Russert, who was a friend of hers, and when he hosted Meet the Press, would have her on fairly frequently. And kind of they had a fascinating conversation at one point of Russert kind of asking her, about the good old days, and, were things kind of kinder and gentler when you first started out, and was it a nicer political system, and kind of have things kind of gone badly now? And Mary was quite firm with him. She said, "Oh, you mean perhaps you're thinking of Joe McCarthy or Richard Nixon, that there weren't good old days necessarily, that these problems and kind of demagoguery and threats and, there is nothing new under the sun as far as American politics go. But it's up to us and our better angels to meet those moments and take them on." And, and I think that core conviction of people to organize and take on vested interests really stands out in her work. And I think it's a very useful reminder for us that these things matter a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how was her relationship with the first candidate George, and then Gentleman George, and then the President George?
You would think that the first President Bush, that they would have kind of gotten along better. They never did very well. And she absolutely bedeviled him about the Iran-Contra stuff that he was pretty centrally involved with. And actually, at one point that she wrote a column of open questions that she thought that then Vice President Bush should answer. And it was a column of raising a bunch of questions, and George Bush saw an opportunity and wrote out a column of his own that basically answered those questions. Yet, ironically, it was his answers to those questions that were printed in the Washington Post that led to investigator Lawrence Walsh, who was the special counsel looking into Iran-Contra, that essentially gave him the smoking gun, because the Secretaries of State and Defense saw the column and had a phone conversation where somebody took notes and said, "What's he saying? None of this isn't true." And those notes came out later. So again, Mary asking what seemed like fairly innocent questions seemed to have fairly significant results at the end of the day. And it actually became public at one point that George Bush had confided in his diary at one point that of Mary, "She's destroyed me over and over again," which again is really interesting. The degree from Johnson and Kennedy and Nixon and George W., the first President Bush, how closely they read her stuff and how seriously they took it. That you're talking about a person in the most powerful job in the land who absolutely is just driven to distraction by one of Mary's columns. And I think that speaks to her skills as a writer and the platform she had. George W. Bush, she was not a great fan, that she didn't like the fact that he wasn't very inquisitive, that he didn't really come across as a very learned guy in a lot of ways, that she thought he was kind of a little too frat boy for her taste, which I think is understandable. And I think one of the really interesting incidents from her career was a couple days after the September 11th attacks, Mary wrote a column about President Bush's behavior and response on September 11th. And, and she said, you read the column today, it doesn't read that controversial, that she said that he was hesitant and somewhat diffident, that he flew to a different number of air bases before he returned to Washington. He was halting in his response. And she actually thought that Rudy Giuliani in New York did a much better job appearing before the microphones, reassuring the public, making clear statements. And, and from the long view of history, I think most people will look at Bush's performance on the day of September 11th, and it wasn't fantastic. She got more hate mail from that column than she had at any other point in her long career, from Army McCarthy, from Watergate, from Vietnam, hundreds, thousands of letters and emails in the most vituperative terms possible. Just calling her unspeakable names, traitorous, she should be hung, she should be shot. And I can certainly understand the upset at that great moment of tragedy and people feeling that she kind of stepped into that somehow. But at the same point, again, it speaks to her willingness as a journalist to speak out when it isn't necessarily convenient to do so. And I think her willingness to be critical in some of those days after September 11th, if there were more people willing to be critical of some of the decisions our government were making at that time, we probably would have saved ourselves a lot of long-term grief. But because of the enormity of the tragedy, I think there was a willingness to kind of let the president do whatever he wants. And in those moments, presidents often make some bad decisions. It was a very tough relationship with George W. Bush. And in some ways that she was, again, cutting against the grain of national opinion very late in her career and very late in her life.
So with the 50-year span of her career, what saga she lives, or what should a budding journalist take away from it, or especially if a women journalist who are enjoying the kind of the path she has trailblazed and may not realize the sacrifices and challenges that she had to make and overcome?
Yeah, I think the lesson for not only women journalists, but anybody who writes or anybody who kind of wants to get ahead at what they do is persistence. That she had a vision of what she wanted to do from an early age, and she worked really, really hard to pursue it. That you look at her life and her career, it wasn't serendipity. It wasn't some magical opportunity that just fell in her lap. It was her willingness to keep after it for years and decades. Her writing, beautiful, graceful writing, that she sweated over. She edited, re-edited, edited again, tore it up, worked at it, plugged away, got out there, acted like a police reporter, asked people hard questions, followed up, went to the events, went to congressional hearings, which are not always particularly electrifying, but she could turn them into something interesting in her writing. And I think that willingness to hone her craft over time, with persistence, with practice. And when people say no, her willingness not to take no for an answer. I think that's the real lesson of what was really a remarkable career and a remarkable life.
Mm-hmm. So much about the book and the topic and the context of the book. Tell us a little bit more about you. How did you end up writing, and what led you to here in the last 20, 25 years or longer that you've been working on?
My day job is mostly international work, and this was a bit of a busman's holiday for me. My other work, earlier books that were much smaller books, were on international issues. Much of my career has been spent working in countries affected by conflict. But, I saw Mary's story, and I just wanted to take it on. I poked away at it. As I said, I've got a day job, so this was kind of done on weekends and on the metro and evenings and mornings. So it took me a fair amount of time to write. Obviously, Mary lived a long time. She wrote a prodigious amount of columns. There was lots of interviewing to do. So, it was, I'd imagine this happens to a lot of biographers, but this was my first biography that I started out terrified that I wouldn't have any material to work with. And then suddenly I had a 1,500-page manuscript that needed to be about a fifth the size and more than I knew what to do with. But in a lot of ways, that was really a blessing in that between the interviews and her own writings and where she appeared in other people's materials and her papers at the Library of Congress, it made so that I was able to kind of pick and choose which scenes and vignettes I thought were really illuminating as to her life and career and really hung together, and to not hold on to those that didn't hold together so well. So it gave me just a lot of material to work with. But, it's also very intimidating writing about somebody who is a really fantastic writer, because you can imagine what a bad review would look like. But thankfully, the reviews have been pretty kind, and it's been wonderful since the book has come out that meeting lots of people who's Mary who touched their lives in different ways. And I was at a book event here in Washington, and the older gentleman ambled up to the table and said that he'd shared a desk with Mary in the book review department of the Washington Star in 1948. So, yeah, lots of surprises even after I was done.
Wow. Are you working on any other topics now that you may be able to discuss? Are more books in the way, or you would consider writing more? Yeah,
I'm starting to kind of plunge into research for the next one. The paperback version of Mary McGrory just came out. It focuses on an interesting espionage case from World War II, a little bit removed as a subject, but I think one of the things for me that I really appreciate as an author is, it's a chance for me not only to take readers to some place they haven't been, but for me to go places that I haven't been and to learn things that I don't know as much about. So I know lots of writers are attracted to kind of a very narrow, or a lot of agents probably encourage them to stick to a very narrow band of topics. I think it's a little more fun to cover a little bit of ground and kind of dive into a different topic. So I will keep plugging away on that, and hopefully have more development soon.
Thank you very much. We have been speaking with John Norris, the author of Mary McGrory, the trailblazing columnist who stood Washington on its head. Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and please keep us in mind for the next books that you may be working on.
I will, absolutely, and thanks so much.
Thank you.